What happens when sola fide is argued not by theology, but by analogy? We will go over 7 passages that have been turned into metaphors for Protestant doctrine, all on this episode of Crux Sacra Apologetics. Now, you may be wondering why this would even matter, or why this would be a strong argument worth considering. Arguing by means of analogy usually can never become a substantial proof because of its lack of hard evidence. If anything, arguments by metaphor would typically be used as starting openers to frame the doctrine as being intuitive, even if not definitive, or such analogies will be the last line of defense, claiming that going against certain proposed doctrines would mean going against cohesive narrative themes found in the Bible. So to be clear, we're not talking about theological teachings that are said explicitly. We are talking about certain stories or instances recorded in Scripture that are propped up as being analogous to the system of sola fide, and therefore acts as further supporting evidence. So what are examples of these? There are a lot of them, but we will be going over 7 common examples. The first one is an analogy from Genesis, after the fall when Adam and Eve slaughter a lamb in order to make clothes for themselves. Some of you might be wondering, how on earth does that prove sola fide? The answer is, it doesn't prove it, but it serves as an analogy for how being saved by faith alone supposedly works. The specific example would be about alien righteousness. That is, since the belief is that we are solely clothed with the righteousness of Christ, with no righteousness created through us, and this alien righteousness is received by faith alone. That is, since the belief is that we are solely clothed in the righteousness of Christ, with no righteousness created through us, and this alien righteousness is received by faith alone, then any affirmation that righteousness only comes from without and never from within, even by the help of God, is an affirmation of the sola fide doctrine. So what do we have? Adam and Eve, after the fall, recognized their nakedness. Therefore, through the death of a lamb, they were clothed. Therefore, this is a Christological analogy for how they were clothed by the righteousness of Christ through his death. Now, even from a Catholic perspective, this is not all that bad. It just depends on what we would say that the story asserts. We are indeed made righteous through the righteousness of Christ. That full reconciliation with the Father would not be possible without his death on the cross. However, and this will be a key distinction between Catholic theology and that of many Protestant denominations, is how receiving righteousness is not a legal fiction. That is, according to the doctrine of alien righteousness, we are clothed with righteousness, and that is said to imply that we are simultaneously sinner and justified. That is to say, we are not truly righteous under this view, but only legally righteous in the eyes of God. This is different from Catholicism, that once God pronounces us as justified, this is a transformative righteousness, not one in name only. So let's go over if this applies to Adam and Eve. If Adam and Eve are naked, but they were clothed by the Lamb, are they simultaneously both naked and clothed? The answer is no. They were transformed from being naked to being clothed. And this is the nuance that would need to be pointed out if the story attempts to prove sola fide. The assertion is long-winded, but if it is argued that Adam and Eve clothed their nakedness with the Lamb, just how we are sinners who clothe ourselves with Christ, that is not entirely inaccurate. But if the further tenets of alien righteousness is argued from this passage, to say that we are not truly righteous but only legally righteous, that would be false even according to this analogy. Since Adam and Eve were not legally clothed, they were truly clothed. That they weren't still naked, but that their nakedness was completely gone because of the Lamb, which is more akin to the analogy of transformative righteousness, not sola fide. The second analogy will be that of Isaac and the ram. Essentially, Abraham was told to sacrifice Isaac, but at the last moment, an angel told him to sacrifice a ram instead. Therefore, the ram is said to represent Christ, who takes our place in death so that we might live. Now, this is a Christological analogy, and it is true that Jesus died so that we might avoid the eternal death. But something further is sometimes argued from this passage, and that would be the idea of penal substitutionary atonement. This would be the idea that Jesus didn't merely die for us, but he distinctly was punished by the Father so that we might avoid being punished by the Father, because the punishment was satisfied against Jesus. There are many contradictions in this notion, such as if it is unjust for an innocent person to suffer the punishments of a guilty person, then that would mean that God the Father is enacting an unjust act against his own Son, which would introduce injustice and disunity in the Trinity. However, Isaac and the ram cannot be used to argue for penal substitutionary atonement. There is an element of substitution to the Passion of Christ, because he dies so that we might not die. However, this is different from saying he is punished with our punishment, and that is clearly not the case with this particular passage. Isaac was not to be sacrificed as a punishment against him, but as an act of worship unto God. Therefore, the ram was not inheriting Isaac's punishment, but that he was saved from death by the sacrifice of worship that was accomplished through the ram. So, as it turns out, this is not affirmation of penal substitutionary atonement, which would be linked to the doctrine of Sola Fide, but instead we have the same system of sacrificial worship, which was something fulfilled perfectly on the cross of Calvary in perfect alignment with Catholic theology. The third analogy is going to be the Bronze Serpent. This is a story that not many people seem to know of, but it is a classic that involves Moses and is even referenced by Jesus in the Gospels. The Israelites were complaining against Moses and against God, and in retribution, God sends serpents among the people who bite them with venom. After the Israelites repent and ask Moses to intercede for them, God gave instructions to Moses to create a bronze serpent. It was to be hoisted onto a pole, and everyone who would look upon the serpent would be healed from the venom. Even Jesus makes mention of this story as an analogy to his own death, that, just like how the serpent was set on a pole, Jesus was set on a cross, and this was done so that we might be saved from death. However, this analogy is taken further when people use it as a case to prove sola fide, which is beyond what can be substantiated. How the argument goes is that the Israelites were saved from the venom, that is, sin, not by any works that they did, but purely by looking upon the bronze serpent, which would be analogous to believing in Christ. Therefore, if their saving came through faith, metaphorically speaking, and without works, then this vindicates sola fide. They didn't need to do anything except look upon the bronze serpent, just as we don't need to do anything except believe on Christ. So we'll need to make a few clarifications. Catholics do believe that faith saves a person, even before they do good works. This would be the idea of initial justification. However, Catholics say works are necessary, not because they take someone from being unsaved to saved, but because they're needed to preserve the relationship with God and thus ensure salvation. So to prove sola fide from this passage, it's not enough simply to point out that people are saved by faith. You would have to show that faith is the only thing needed to avoid all divine punishment. This actually fits really well for the Mosaic stories. So let's ask, once the Israelites looked upon the bronze serpent and were healed, were they safe from all divine punishments later? The answer is no. Later in the book of Numbers, you have a scourge of fornication and idolatry among the Israelites, and a plague causes their deaths and retribution. Several other instances are categorized like this even after the bronze serpent. Therefore, not everyone who was bitten but then healed by the serpent ended up living and not experiencing divine punishment. What they had to do was continue in faithfulness to God, which absolutely would imply works, in order to avoid the sin and therefore avoid the punishment. Not everyone who was saved from the venom avoided all punishment for later sins, so therefore being saved even through faith does not guarantee they will always remain saved. Likewise, someone can be saved by faith apart from works initially, but that does not promise that all they would need is faith in order to continue to remain saved. This would be the Catholic view, but not a Protestant view under sola fide. The fourth example is going to be a collection of stories. This is going to be every time that Jesus performed a miracle and attributed their saving to their faith. We can see this many times throughout the Gospels, usually before or after a healing of some sort. Jesus will say things like, "Your faith has made you well, according to your faith let it be done to you, and your faith has saved you, go in peace." But there is one particular portion that I don't see being used, but we will bring it up as a steel man to this argument. This is going to be in Mark 5. While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, Do not fear, only believe. The Greek word here is monon, usually translated as only, and sometimes translated as alone. So if we should focus on any passage, likely this would be a good one. And I don't think people would argue that this is a poor representation of the overall argument. Over and over again, we see Jesus heal people, and don't ask of them works, but only ask of them faith. Therefore, does this vindicate sola fide, not as a strict theology being taught here, but as a biblical theme that the only thing needed to be saved is faith? The answer, once again, would be no, and here is why. As we already discussed from the Bronze Serpent, Catholics would agree that it is by faith that we are taken from death to life. But that is different from saying that faith alone is all that someone needs to preserve their saved state. Even if they were bitten and healed by the serpent, they could fall into punishment later. In the same way, someone who is healed from a disease could fall into disease later. Someone whose body is maimed could end up becoming maimed again if they're not careful. And even if someone is risen from the dead, that is not a guarantee that they will not die later. So yes, we can affirm that faith is needed to pass from death to life. And this is even before any works are necessary. But that doesn't mean that we can't fall back into the same state of death that we were previously saved from, thus requiring works in order to retain the life that has been graciously given. The fifth example is going to be the story of Lazarus, an associate of Jesus, whom he raised from the dead, and this one is particularly common. It follows that Lazarus was dead, then Jesus commanded him, Lazarus come out, and then Lazarus was changed from dead to living. This one will be most common amongst Calvinists, saying that not even faith was required of Lazarus in order to go from dead to living. Therefore, this is an entirely monergic process, being completed entirely by Christ and nothing of Lazarus. A dead person can't do anything after all. Therefore, Christ did everything in his metaphorical salvation. But is that really what's going on here? Yes, we can affirm that without God, we can do nothing. However, that doesn't entail that our salvation has nothing to do with our cooperation with the free grace that God gives us. When Jesus says, Lazarus come out, Lazarus went from death to life. However, that alone didn't bring him out of the tomb, but Lazarus obeyed the command and walked out of the tomb himself. Some might say that there was no way Lazarus could do that without Jesus, but there is nothing wrong with that. Even Catholicism affirms that we cannot be saved without Christ, but our cooperation with his grace is required. Therefore, this is not a monergic process stemming only from Christ, but this is Christ taking him from death to life, and then Lazarus choosing to obey him and walk out of the tomb. Christ could have risen him, and Lazarus could have chosen to remain in the tomb, but that is not what happened. Therefore, this is not a monergy, but a synergy of Christ saving Lazarus and Lazarus obeying Christ, all in order to take him from the death of the tomb into the light of day. The sixth example would be less used, but this would be Peter walking on the water. A well-known story of Jesus walking on the water towards the boat of the apostles. Peter asks Jesus to command him to walk to him. Jesus commands it, and Peter leaves the boat and walks on the water. Already, this is a great metaphor for the power of faith and what it would allow a person to do, or that we can reach God by walking through faith. But then, Peter begins to doubt because of the waves, and he begins to sink. While drowning, he calls out to Jesus to save him, and Jesus pulls him out of the water, and they both walk back to the boat. Now, some might use this as an analogy for sola fide, saying that since this was made possible by faith, the only way to be saved is through faith and not of works. However, this is less common because it is more difficult to make that argument here. Peter didn't only have faith. He also had works. He didn't just only believe it was Jesus approaching, but after having faith, he walked upon the water, which would be actions that he took of his own volition. This makes this a great blending of faith and works, but also this would be a hermeneutic against once saved, always saved. This theology would say that if you have faith, you can never lose it, and if you lose your faith, then you never had it to begin with. However, with Peter, he had faith so as to walk upon the waters, but then lost that faith so that he began to drown. If once saved, always saved theologians would say that Peter never lost faith, then he should have never drowned in the water, but would have always stayed afloat. But if they were to say that Peter never truly had faith, but a false faith that he ended up losing, then a false faith would have never allowed him to walk on the water to begin with. Therefore, a faith that can walk upon waters can even be lost due to a lack of virtue. Therefore, we do need to call out to God to save us, but it's very possible for us to lose that faith that gave us salvation, which requires works and virtue to preserve. And our last example we will be going over today is the idea of the sheep and the shepherd. This one is likely the most popular overall, describing Jesus as the shepherd and his people as the sheep. The sheep are those who hear his voice and listen to him, and many equivocate this with having faith. Therefore, we are sheep of the shepherd by faith. None of this is outlandish to say because Catholics agree on the necessity of faith. But the analogy then argues further. This is with some saying that all you need is faith and you will never be lost, as the passage then goes on to give an example of a sheep that is lost, and then the shepherd who will leave the 99 to go find the one lost one. And then, if he finds it, he will bring it back. Some take this to mean that Jesus will never lose his sheep. And if we are his sheep only by faith, then we will never lose our way from God. However, that's not what this passage technically says. If we were to read it, we can find that it says, "And if he finds it, truly I tell you, he rejoices over it more than the 99 that never went astray." The key factor here is the word "ian," which means if, very consistently, and is a conditional particle that denotes uncertainty. So the shepherd finding the lost sheep is not a matter of certainty, but a matter of if, which means you can wander from the flock and possibly not be found. So what does this mean for the thesis? Hypothetically, if we are part of the flock by faith alone, then it would also be possible to be lost from the flock that you once belonged to. This would mean that to remain in the flock, or to recover from being lost, would require something more than just faith alone. Otherwise, if we are once saved, always saved, a true believer would never become lost. Or if someone is lost, then they were never part of the flock to begin with, and both case scenarios are false in this parable. To summarize, it's easy to say that the entire Bible has a thematic message of Sola Fide, therefore it would be crazy to question it. However, upon a further reading, even a thematic message of faith saving would not be contradictory to Catholic theology. Rather, it's very common to see people read into the text a hermeneutic centered on faith alone doctrine, when the scriptures actually are not in alignment with their Protestant traditions. If you want more Catholic apologetics, be sure to like and subscribe and stay tuned for our future videos. But until next time, thank you all for watching.